Welcome back to another blazing edition of Hot Topics, the podcast powered by the Suncoast Tampa Living Network, where we dig into the ideas, innovations, and real life experiences shaping business, leadership, and the future of our industry. I'm your host, Quan Rimmer, and today's topic is one that realtors and buyers across Florida are navigating more than ever, as flood zones, insurance costs, and risk assessments continue to shape purchasing decisions. From understanding map designations to evaluating insurance costs and navigating due diligence, flood risk is now a critical part of the home buying conversation, and realtors play a key role in helping buyers to understand what they should be asking and when. Today, we're joined by two industry experts who work on the front lines, helping buyers and realtors understand flood risk, insurance requirements, and what it really means when a property is located in or near a flood zone. They bring insight into coverage, cost, and the key questions buyers should be asking before moving forward. And we're recording live from the Fabre Framework studio. Fabre Frameworks, your one-stop shop for real estate photography that helps listings shine. Visit FabreFrameworks.com to elevate your next listing. And now, joining us today, we have a tag team from Florida Best Quote Insurance, bringing both leadership perspective and day-to-day client expertise. First, we have the agency director at Florida Best Quote. With more than 16 years as a licensed insurance professional, she is the senior agent and a trusted resource for realtors and buyers navigating flood zones, NFIP requirements, and private flood options. She's also a frequent speaker at brokerages, town halls, industry events, educating agents on how flood insurance impacts transactions and how to help clients make informed decisions. We have Lindsay O'Donnell.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Oh, yes. And joining her is the Director of Business Development at Florida Best Quote. He has spent over a decade helping buyers, sellers, realtors navigate one of the most unpredictable pieces of any transaction, insurance. Known for his hands-on approach and deep knowledge, he partners with real estate professionals across the Bay. And when insurance gets complicated, he's the one agents call. We have with us the one and only Jason Mears.
Thank you, Quan. I'm pumped up.
I'm glad. Entering this heat together, bringing a powerful combination of strategic insight and real-world transaction experience. This is a true tag team helping Florida realtors and buyers navigate one of the most complex parts of our market. Welcome them to Hot Topics.
Yes.
We're glad to be here.
Yes.
I'm glad. Let's hop right into the questions. What are the first three questions every buyer should ask when a property is in or near a flood zone?
Good question. So first question that I would ask if I were a buyer on a house that might be in or near a flood zone is I'd ask for a flood zone determination, which is going to tell us the exact flood zone we're in and any pertinent information about prior flood zones. And I'm also going to ask to see the flood map and see what the flood zone looks like, how close I am to it. The second question I'm going to ask every single time is if the seller has a flood policy in place, and then to ask to see a copy of it, because we'll probably get into that a little bit more, but I can try and match that rate and gives me an idea of what the premium is to insure the home for flood. Third, and probably most important question is, has there ever been a flood on the property, or has a flood claim ever been filed? You want to ask both ways because you could have a flood without a claim being filed if there was no insurance. So ask both of those. And I'd probably go a little bit further and also ask if there's ever been flooding in the neighborhood, because maybe houses nearby have flooded, but not this one. And that can be good information to know.
That's a good one. I didn't think about that one. In the neighborhood.
Neighbors. Always reach out to neighbors if you can. You see one taking the trash out, ask them about it. Yes.
Yeah.
Good. What's the difference between Zone AE, X, VE, and how should buyers interpret those classifications?
Absolutely. So Zone A means that you're in you have a 1% chance of flooding in any given year. So you're in a flood zone in flood zone A. V as in Victor means that you are in that still have that 1% chance of flooding in a given year, but they're also taking wave action into account. So the V stands for velocity. You're going to see V zones right on the coast. So the biggest difference with a V zone is that the risk of severe damage or significant damage to the house is a lot higher. If you just have water come into the house slowly in an A zone, everything gets wet, we got to replace it. But if you have waves beating against the house, you might have your house actually knocked off the foundation, completely destroyed and demolished by that. So V is going to be higher premiums. A is still high premiums because flood insurance is not cheap these days. And then X zone means that you're outside of a 0.2% chance of flooding happening in any given year. So if you're in A or V and you're getting a mortgage on the property, then flood insurance will be required by them. If you're in zone X, you are still in a flood zone. However, a lender will not require flood insurance. So just something to keep in mind.
X is a low enough risk where the lender's not going to require it, but it doesn't mean it's no risk. It's just a low risk, not no risk. And I always kind of, as a joke, I always tell people, they like, what does VE flood zone? I just say it just means very expensive.
Oh, that's a good one. That's a good one.
In a little trick, the E doesn't really mean anything. It just depends on who's determining the flood zone or the base flood elevation. So if you see A8, A10, all that matters is the A or the V. And then just a little side note, there is an X500 zone, which is still outside of that 1% chance, but you're inside the 0.2% chance. So slightly closer to a flood zone, slightly higher risk. Just kind of a little note there.
Yeah, that's good. How reliable are FEMA maps in Florida given all of our rapid development?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say personally, from my perspective, as far as the houses that they are putting in flood zones, I'd say they're more reliable. The ones that they're putting outside of flood zones, where you have homes that are flooding just due to drainage issues, that's where they're not as up to date and I don't think as accurate. So it's, if you're in a flood zone on a flood map, flood insurance is definitely a really good idea to think about. The chances of flooding are higher, but obviously they can't predict the future. They're going off of historical data. They're going off of estimated elevations. It's not a perfect system. So it's just kind of really the best way to look at it is if you're buying a house in Florida, you are in a flood zone.
Mm-hmm. How can buyers, verify a property's actual flood risk beyond these FEMA maps?
That's another good question.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of things that you can kind of look into there. So obviously the flood map gives you a good amount of information. Again, finding out if there's been a flood loss history on the house. So one thing to know is that myself and Jason as insurance agents, we cannot see flood history on a property. The only thing that we can look up is if it's a severe repetitive loss property, which means it's had several flood claims that have been filed on the property, and then we get notification of that. But one flood loss, two flood losses, we can't see that anywhere. The NFIP and FEMA currently consider that private information. So the only person who can look up a house's flood history is the current owner. So asking the seller, would you be comfortable pulling a loss history report for me, will tell you if there's ever been a flood claim filed on the property. Now, of course, if they didn't have flood insurance and had flood damage, you're not going to see a claim. So permits can help kind of getting an idea for that. And then also, like I mentioned a little bit ago, asking neighbors, has this ever flooded? Have you ever seen water in the streets? Have any homes in the area flooded? And then even beyond that, I would just kind of take a look at if your house is elevated at all. So if there's a few steps to get into the house, then if there are drainage issues and rain accumulates a little bit, it's less likely it will get in. Whereas if everything is slab on grade and right next to the ground, if we were to have a drainage issue suddenly, it might be more likely to have some water come in. So just a few extra things to kind of keep an eye on and look out for.
Yeah, and it's really important. The more we're talking, I just realize there's more and more things that buyers need to know, and a lot of that you're getting from the sellers. And so the earliest you can start gathering this information, like the flood policy from the seller, getting them to contact FEMA to request a report that shows any prior flood losses in the history of the home, things like that. As early as that can be done, the better for the buyers.
How often do these flood zone designations change, and how should that impact purchasing decisions?
So they can change. The maps can be updated at any given time, generally around every 5 years. They might do a redo of them. Every 10 to 20 years is probably when they do a total overhaul. They actually did the last total overhaul around 2020 to 2022. I think somewhere in 2023 in Florida, but that's when they did the last major overhaul. They did add an additional designation that really just had to do with new construction, not flood zones and flood insurance purchasing. But it's just a good idea to keep in mind that it can change at any point in time, and getting flood quotes, even if you don't intend to purchase it right now, can give you an idea. And that's actually another way to find out how risky your house or how at risk your house is for flooding, is looking at what the insurance rates are. If the quotes are coming in significantly higher, the carriers are probably estimating there's a high likelihood of flooding happening. So if you get a rate that's $300 for the year, you're probably in a pretty good spot, and it's unlikely that it will ever move into a flood zone.
Can you explain what is LOMA or LOMR, and when should a buyer pursue one?
Yes, absolutely. So it's a letter of map amendment or a letter of map revision. So a letter of map amendment is a process where you can get a specific house removed from a flood zone. So and I'll get into what that is. A letter of map revision is used when you actually elevate all of the ground. So think of this where you have new communities being built. When a builder's coming into an area and the location is in a flood zone, they'll bring in a bunch of fill dirt and they'll actually elevate the entire neighborhood to get it up out of the flood zone. Fascinating stuff. Once they do that, they submit for a letter of map revision, because then they're selling all these houses and they're in X zones, not in A or A flood zones. Generally, is the case. To know whether or not you qualify for a letter of map amendment, you have to get an elevation certificate first. And on that elevation certificate, it's going to tell you what the base flood elevation is, which is the elevation at which flooding is expected to occur. And then there's a number on there that says lowest adjacent grade. And that's the lowest elevation directly next to the house. So the lowest elevation of the ground directly next to the house. If that elevation is higher than the base flood elevation, then technically your house is not considered in a flood zone, and you can have your house removed from it by submitting to FEMA for review. So it's kind of a complicated process. It can take a while. There are companies out there that can help go through the process, but the first step is getting that elevation certificate and then having a well-educated insurance agent take a look to see if they think you qualify, and then they can advise if you should submit for that or not.
Yeah, the main thing is just to call us on those sorts of things, because we do have resources that can help get those LOMA letters done for people. So as with anything, call us if you have questions about that.
Yeah.
Good. Can a buyer challenge a flood zone designation before closing?
So that's a little tricky. The LOMA process takes a long time with FEMA. Depending on if you do it yourself, it can take a few months. If you do it through a contractor who works with them, it can be a little faster. So generally, there's not enough time for a LOMA before closing. It's something you can look into after the fact. However, it is good to know or to be aware of the fact that not all flood zone determinations are created equal. So there are some companies, when they run their flood zone determination, they're just looking at a general map and kind of putting a pretend little house on there and saying, oh, it's in a flood zone or it's not. So lenders usually run pretty good flood zone determinations, but there may be insurance companies or other avenues that don't pull a great one. So if you think there's a chance that flood zone, that you're not actually in a flood zone, and it literally, in order to be in a flood zone and have that requirement, just one little piece of the house has to be in the flood zone on the map. Like it could just be a tiny little corner. If it's in the flood zone, flood insurance is required, even if the whole house is, the rest of the house is not.
I've seen it where it's the corner of the pool cage. Just the back corner of the pool cage is in like an A, but the whole home is in an X, and that's going to rate the whole home as an AE.
So for that, if it's a situation where you think that the map that's being used or the flood zone determination being used is not accurate, we could try and fight that. And really, you're just fighting that with the lender to see if they'll remove their requirement for flood insurance. That would be the process there. And again, any licensed insurance agent can take a look at those maps and help guide and advise if they think that the determination being used is not accurate.
And this is why we really push hard getting flood quotes done on listings. We do that for sellers. But also doing it for have the buyers request flood quotes at the very, very beginning. Because just because a home is in an AE flood zone, it doesn't mean that the rate is going to be thousands of dollars, right? There are rates sometimes in the AE flood zone that are pretty reasonable. And so for the buyer to know that ahead of time, up front, even before they, sometimes make a contract, but know it at the very beginning of the process, can help them decide whether they want to fight it or not. Because maybe it's in an AE flood zone and it's $1,000 and they're good with that.
Good to know. What is the biggest misconception buyers have about flood insurance in Florida?
That's a loaded question.
I
Yeah.
know.
And we probably have different answers on that.
Yeah,
Go
I mean,
ahead.
there's a few. One of the biggest ones that can be the most dangerous is assuming that flood insurance is covered by home insurance. So a lot of people think if I have home insurance, if water gets in my house, it will be covered, and it is not. Flood insurance is on a separate policy. And I would say the other one that I would just love to touch on, because this was a big unfortunate learning experience for a lot of people. If you have a house that's elevated, that was built up in a flood zone, built after 1975, and it was elevated to be built to code so that flooding would not happen in the home, it would happen underneath the home. And that first floor gets enclosed, or you add something to it, you make it a mother-in-law suite or add something like that, that area is not covered like the regular house. That area is covered like a basement, which means coverage is extremely limited. Contents coverage is extremely limited. They won't cover finishing. So I would just say, for me personally, is making sure that you know how your house is covered in the event of a loss, not just that you have flood insurance in place, and kind of being prepared for that.
Yeah, and I would say my biggest misconception that I deal with a lot with realtors a lot of times, and with potential buyers, is the idea that I don't need flood insurance. That there's not a risk at all. We talked earlier about you're not in a flood zone, or there's no risk.
I'm in
Is
zone
never
X.
really a thing, because as she mentioned a couple of years ago when we had the wind event and the flood event with Helene and Milton, there were a lot of homes in X flood zones, and probably people who thought, yeah, I'm safe, I'll never flood, and they flooded, got 4 feet of water in their home. So
Sure.
to the idea that she had mentioned earlier that the whole state of Florida is in a flood zone is accurate, and you should never say that you don't need flood insurance. It's always recommended, and that's what we try to push to realtors as they communicate with their buyers, but also when we communicate with buyers as well. We're going to recommend it every time. If it's a single family home, and even if it's in the next flood zone, here's what the rate's going to be, and you have to decide whether you're going to get it or not.
Okay. Let's continue to talking about coverage. Can you break down what a typical flood insurance policy actually covers and what it doesn't?
That's a very good question. And I know a lot of people who went through the claims process
Yeah.
after Helene would have a
A
lot
lot
to
of
say on this
misconceptions
question.
about this.
Yes, yeah. So essentially, the policy itself covers the building, everything attached to the building, and the structure itself does not cover pools, does not cover pool pumps, things like that. Contents can be purchased, so you can either choose to include contents or choose not to have contents coverage on there. Contents would be if you were to take the house and flip it upside down, everything that falls out is your contents. So there's a lot of limitations on flood insurance. The biggest one being it does not cover additional living expenses. And that one is tough. So if your house floods and you have to be out for, I used to say 4 months, what we saw after Helene, I think there's people still trying to get back into their houses. So if you have to be out for an extended period of time, there is no help from the insurance policy through the National Flood Insurance Program. It's not going to cover additional living expenses. It won't cover rent somewhere else. You've now got to pay your mortgage and to live somewhere else. So that's a big one. If private market is an option, you can get that added on. So that's a good one to think about. And then just like I mentioned earlier with the houses that are elevated, where that first floor becomes a basement, it seems like a lot of bonus room, and you got this first floor that's all this extra space, and look what I can make out of it. You need to know that if a flood is coming, that is not covered, and you need to bring everything upstairs to make sure it's fully covered. So that would be the general basics of what's covered and not covered on flood insurance.
Yeah.
How are premiums calculated today, especially with risk rating 2.0?
Yeah, so it used to be just based on the flood zone and the elevation of the home using an elevation certificate or pre-firm rates if the house was older. Now they look at several different things. So the only things they're looking for in the rate, that it does not include the flood zone itself at all. So flood zone is not taken into consideration anymore with flood quoting or flood rates. They're looking at the flooding source. So like ocean is going to be a higher premium than a lake. They're looking at the distance to the flooding source. So the closer you are to the ocean or the closer you are to the lake. They're looking at the elevation of the home. And right now they're actually doing that based on an estimate. So they're asking us, how high up is the first level? Is it on the ground? Is it a few steps up? Is it second floor? Where's the first living area? And then they're using an estimate of the general elevation of the ground and determining how high up the house is to figure out what the rate would be. And then they're looking at the replacement cost of the home.
Yes.
So this was an interesting one that Congress added in with risk rating 2.0, is they decided that someone who can afford a more expensive home can afford to pay more for flood insurance, which so the more expensive the house is to rebuild, even though you're only getting $250,000 of coverage, your premium's going to be higher than someone whose house only costs $250,000 to rebuild. So those are the main factors they're taking into account with rates. You can get an elevation certificate still and use it to see if you can get that rate down a little bit, but it doesn't come into play as much as before. Before risk rating 2.0, if you built a brand new house and you were in an A flood zone, your premium may have been $400 to $600 a year. We actually had people right before risk rating 2.0 came out have us quote flood on their brand new construction homes. $450, it's going to be great. They spent an extra $150,000 to elevate their home, build a code, and then risk rating 2.0 came out. They finished construction right after, and the new rates were $4,500 a year. So that was a really tough pill to swallow. It's just the way it changed. It's tough. So
Yeah.
now, even if you think, my house is 14 feet in the air, it should be $400 to insure, it's never going to flood. That's just not the case anymore, because now the fact that you're that close to a flood zone or to a flooding source is what's really impacting your rates.
And it's been surprising to me. There's a lot of realtors that still don't understand a lot of this part, because risk rating 2.0, it came out several years ago, but back in the day, ex flood zones, those rates were all, you had a chart. And you could just look at the chart. If I have this much coverage, here's the rate, and they're always going to be low. And now, as of risk rating 2.0, because now they're not factoring in the flood zone as much, distance to coast, replacement cost of the home, you can see ex flood zone rates that are $1,000 something, $2,000, and people get like, why is that? Well, risk rating 2.0, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Are there any strategies to kind of reduce those premiums before or after purchase?
Elevating your home can help a
Yeah.
little, but like I just mentioned, it doesn't help as much as it used to. Now it's more of just a requirement that you have to do in a lot of cases. But so elevating your home is the easiest one. I know there's a lot of things out there now, like a lot of flood barriers and things like that. As of right now, those do not impact your rate. So even if you get the like flood barrier you can install in front of the doors and things like that, that doesn't do anything, except if it does keep the water out, then that's obviously ideal for you. You can get flood-proofed items installed that can sometimes help the rate if you get a certification on that. I have not yet seen a house that's older with it, retrofitted with it, but newer construction sometimes utilizes that. And really, it's just what you can do at that point is try to just reduce the actual risk you have, but you're not really going to impact the rate as much unless you're actually changing the elevation of the home.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons we're really, really stressing quoting these listings ahead of time, because you have buyers making offers on homes and going under contract, and they have no idea what the flood insurance is going to be. And then they find out, oh, the flood insurance is $3,000. I'm out, So the more we can get flood quotes done before you go under contract, you can kind of weed out some of I wouldn't say weed out the buyers, but you have buyers that will be making offers that they have a good idea of what the cost is going to be on the insurance side ahead of time, and it can make the transactions smoother, and you don't get under, contract with people that are going to back out.
Perfect. We'll be right back with more from our guests as we keep the conversation burning here on Hot Topics, live from Fabre Frameworks Studio. Fabre Frameworks, your go-to team for professional real estate photography that helps listings stand out, attract attention, and move faster. Learn more at FabreFrameworks.com. All right, it's time to turn up the heat. Welcome to the hot seat. You each will have 2 minutes. Like you're a tag team, so you have 2 minutes. 2 minutes to share why realtors and buyers should connect with your team and how you support clients navigating flood zones and insurance decisions. At this time, the spotlight and heat are all yours.
All right. Thank you. So we're with Florida Best Quote Insurance, and what sets us apart is we were actually an insurance agency built by a realtor to cater to the real estate transaction. It's what we know. We eat, sleep, and breathe the real estate transaction, helping buyers and sellers get to the closing table efficiently, quickly. We work mostly with realtors, and we do listing quotes so we can get that home quoted before there's even buyers trying to find out what the premium is. If you're looking at houses, we'll do quotes for you. you. We don't say you need to get inspections done first and everything done first before we'll even quote it. We will quote it because we know the insurance premium is massively important in the purchasing decision for a home. It goes into all the factors of what your affordability and what you're looking at down the road. So we're here to help you and guide you and get you into the home of your dreams quickly and efficiently. We understand flood insurance. We understand how to get you the best rates. We make sure that we've got the best relationships with our carriers. So not only, and the most carriers, we make sure we have all the carriers to get the best rates. But with those great relationships, it also means we can get exceptions that other agencies might not be able to get. We can get special circumstances approved for us with carriers, which we've done recently for lease backs. If you're leasing back the house to the seller to the seller for a certain period of time, we've gotten a carrier to approve that as a general exception for our agency. So we really just go above and beyond to try and make the purchasing process easier.
Yeah, and we'll brand those listing quotes for you as well. If you're a realtor, all we need is your headshot. We'll put a nice flyer together with your face on it, the quote for home and flood insurance, and you can print that, put it at your open houses. We came up with that idea as a way to really a response to how a lot of listings have been sitting on the market for quite a while. And maybe it would be an opportunity and a way to help sell those so people know when they come and look at the house at an open house, oh, here's a good estimate of what home and flood is, and it'll be something nice that they can print.
Now, you got to definitely make sure you tell people how to find you, how to contact you. Give all your info. This your time.
So you can find us at floridabestquote.com. You can call us at 727-584-9999. I can be emailed at lindsay@floridabestquote.com. That's Lindsay with an E.
And I can be emailed at jason@floridabestquote.com. So Florida spelled out, quote with no S, floridabestquote.com.
Yeah, you can find us on Facebook, Instagram. We're here giving out as much information and helpful information as we can.
And you can find me on Instagram and TikTok at Florida Insurance Tips.
Ooh, I like that. Perfect. You guys did great for the hot seat. Good job.
Thank you.
Let's jump right back into the questions.
All right.
Can flood insurance transfer to a new buyer in Florida?
Good question. It can. That's called assuming the flood policy. So flood insurance is different from home insurance. Home insurance is not transferable. Flood insurance is based on the house. So the flood policies do allow you to change the name when someone purchases a home. You can just assume that policy. Now, that is not what we recommend. They actually have now with Risk Rating 2.0 a grandfathering process with the real estate transaction. So when you assume a flood policy, you are taking on the seller's effective date. So now you've got two different effective dates you've got to keep track of, and your lender has to keep track of payments at two different times a year, which can get messy. You don't get any refund on the policy because it's not canceled. So now realtors, you have to work into the contract how the buyer is going to refund the seller for their portion of the flood policy they already paid because they're not getting a refund from the carrier. Big thing to note, because with high premiums, that could be thousands of dollars the seller is not getting back that they paid out. So instead, we recommend that real estate grandfathering process. In order to do that, all we need is a copy of the seller's flood insurance policy. If they have one through the National Flood Insurance Program, we can take that information and we can match the rate that the seller has on a new policy. So now you have a new effective date that matches your closing, a new policy. You can have your flood policy with the insurance agent of your choice. So you're not stuck with also two policies at two different agencies, because that's likely going to happen with an assumption. So it's a cleaner process. You still get to match the rates. You still get to stick with the glide path that the seller was on. So it really helps in that process. So that's why anytime you ask for a quote from us for a house that's in a flood zone, I've instructed all our agents, if the rate is high, don't even send a quote. Ask for the seller's flood policy first, because you don't want to scare them out of it. So you can get that. Now, the one piece of advice I would give there is if you do see that the seller's flood policy is significantly less, it's not a bad idea to get a fresh quote just to see what the actual rate is for the home. Just if you were to get a fresh quote from the NFIP, because that's the rate that policy is eventually going to head towards. So you'll go up every year, no more than 18% until you finally get to that full risk rate. So that will give you an idea of what the actual premium looks like. But we can still match what the seller has if they're locked into a lower rate right now.
Yes.
So do you recommend buyers rely on the seller's current policy or treat it as a non-transferable risk data?
I would still rely on it as far as what the premiums and costs are going to be at closing and what your initial costs are going to be. The future data just kind of gives you like a 10-year look of what it would be. And now, mind you, that 10-year look, 5-year look, whatever it's going to be at this point in time, it could change. I don't think it will go down because so far FEMA hasn't been the best at managing their rates and no rate reductions really. But it just gives you an idea of if the seller's paying $2,000, but my full risk rate is $8,000, I know eventually I have to be comfortable with that $8,000 if I plan to stay in this house a long time.
And I just love this whole. I've been preaching this to realtors a lot. I love the concept because in a way it almost does away with the whole assumable model, which has all the problems that she mentioned. I don't know if you'd mentioned the fact that a lot of times you have to change the coverage amounts because the coverage amounts that the seller has is not what the new buyer is going to need, and sometimes that has to change. But just the fact that we just press with with the realtors on the selling side, ask them for their current flood policy. If it's NFIP, we don't have to go through an assumable process. We just have to enter the data to get the same rate, and it's a brand new policy. So,
What improvements can homeowners make to mitigate flood risk and lower insurance costs?
So the lowering of the insurance costs, really the only way to do that is elevate the home. Yeah, you gotta lift it up and get it above that base flood elevation where they're estimating flooding to happen. That's right now the main part to get rates down. Otherwise, if you do get in or put in flood proofing materials, so basically there's drywall and things like that you can install that are meant to get wet. So if it gets wet, you don't have to replace it all. There's all sorts of different things that they're coming out with to do that. It's still not going to change the rate significantly. You have to go through some extra hoops to get any changes or adjustments. There could be cases where flood vents might help reduce the rate a little bit, which is just adding some openings. I just don't see that as much because usually in those situations, those houses were already built to code, so they have the vents installed.
right.
But so changing the premium is tough on flood. You can adjust your flood premium if you increase deductibles or reduce the contents coverage in order to just get that rate down as it is. But even beyond that, it's really not a bad idea to consider taking steps to help keep water out. So just as a quick example, my house experienced some flooding during Milton from rain accumulation. And I had some cracks in my walls, a couple of the walls. And if I had just filled in those cracks, that water never would have come into my house. But because there were the cracks in the walls, and I'm an insurance agent, I've heard carriers for 16 years say you need to fill in the cracks in the foundation. I still had them there, and that's how some water got in. So things like that, if I had just put tarps out and done any steps, I could have kept out a lot of the water. So the biggest thing really would just be knowing that it could happen, even if it's never happened in 50 years. And when we have a storm coming and someone like Dennis Phillips tells you that you need to be cautious and that flooding could happen, take any steps you can to mitigate water entering your house.
Are there any certain areas becoming uninsurable or cost prohibitive? And what does that mean for property values?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say that they're becoming uninsurable or cost prohibitive in general areas. You will have houses that now, because of Helene, Debbie, Ida, all the storms that recently have come through and caused flooding, they've had significant losses several times over. So if those houses are staying at slab on grade where they currently are, those houses may become extremely expensive to insure because now you have to go through the NFIP direct. So that can just change the premiums there. But what you're seeing is a lot of those houses are ending up elevated and they're in a better situation. They get out of that. So the only thing that can really impact overall being able to get flood insurance is if the community is no longer in the flood insurance program with the NFIP. That can impact things. We don't have that happening in our area. It happened a bit south of us after Ian. Or if you're in a COBRA zone, but even those, and that's just our coastal barrier restricted area, I think something like that. Those areas can be a little bit trickier to insure, but there are carriers who insure them. So overall, it's just the premium changes. It's the fact that if you're close to the ocean, you might be looking at, if there's no prior flood insurance policy in place, $6,000 to $11,000 a year in flood insurance. So only someone who can afford that added cost is really going to be able to buy in those areas. So it's really just pricing some buyers out of coastal locations as far as not being able to afford the house in general that they may have been able to afford previously.
How can realtors confidently discuss flood risk without overstepping into the insurance advising?
I think that this is something that we preach a lot because we do have a lot of realtors, I feel like, that try to speak too much to this. And, they'll say things like, you don't need flood insurance, as we mentioned before, or you're not in a flood zone. And it can give a little bit of too much of a confidence, give too much false confidence to the person to think, well, I just can't flood. And we've learned that that's just not the case. And so we really, really stress, just from a legal standpoint, even for realtors, if they start saying these things that are a little too, almost like making promises they can't keep, that they could get, that we don't want them to get in trouble for that. So leave that to us. We'll run the flood zone determinations. We're going to run flood quotes for all the homes. And we just tell you, flood insurance is not required by your lender, but we're still going to recommend it because there's no guarantee, even if you're in an X flood zone, that you're not going to flood.
Yeah, sticking to the theme that anywhere in Florida is in a flood zone is a good way to have the conversation, that it's always good to consider it and make sure you're protected, and just advising buyers to speak with their lender and speak with their insurance agent about their overall risk. I remember one thing that stands out to me a lot was after Hurricane Harvey in Texas, they had so many of their claims were in X flood zones. And I read an article about it, about someone who'd experienced like 4 feet of water in their house. And this person said to the reporter, my realtor told me I was in an X flood zone, so I didn't need flood insurance, and I flooded. So he didn't say my insurance agent told me. He didn't say my lender told me. He said my realtor told me. And that really hit home for me. So I think just making sure we stick to the conversation of it can happen anywhere, and you should really just look into the rates and talk to a qualified and licensed individual and get some guidance and get a better understanding of what your overall risk is.
Never say you don't need it, and never say that it's not required. It's always recommended.
Yes. What tools or resources do you recommend realtors use to educate buyers quickly and accurately?
Oh, well, we have a really good one. On our website, floridabestquote.com, we actually have a link where realtors can go on there and quote flood insurance for a property themselves. So you can put in the address, get a quote back. So you could, if it's late at night and you're looking at houses or weekends, you could get an idea of the rate. Mind you, not all of our carriers are on there, so always reach out to us to get the best flood rate. But that can at least give you an idea of what the numbers look like. And then also, as far as just educating yourself on everything, they can utilize the msc.fema.gov. That's Map Service Center. msc.fema.gov is the flood map site. So going on there can give you not only a picture of if that house itself is in a flood zone, is a neighborhood in a flood zone, is there a flood zone close by, and you can kind of get an idea of what's going on there. And then really, first and foremost, reaching out to the listing agent to find out if the seller has a flood policy and find out if there's been any flood losses that they can let you know about.
Yeah, just to retouch on one thing she said, the importance of or the possibility of how important this could be to have an option over the weekend. That's when, if you've got a buyer, I want to make an offer on this house. Do you have any idea what the flood insurance is going to be? Well, yeah, go to floridabestquote.com, put in go to the flood tab, put in the address, couple things about the house, and it'll run quotes using, I think, 5 of our carriers. We have close to 20, I think now, including private flood carriers, but it'll at least give them a number. Now, which is worst case scenario, it could be some of our other companies might be better, and we could run those quotes on Monday and give them, hey, it's even cheaper than that, but at least gives them a number they can work with, and they can make an offer over the weekend.
Good, I like that. How is climate risk impacting insurance availability in Florida right now?
I wouldn't say it's impacting availability because flood insurance is still available everywhere. Maybe just overall rates. We did have the private market come out. So prior to 2012, the only place you could get flood insurance was through the National Flood Insurance Program. In 2012, when they started trying to really hike up rates because FEMA and the NFIP were like $23 billion in debt. When they started changing the rates, they did come out with allowing private market carriers to come in and offer flood insurance. So that market has been a little bit more volatile over the years just because we have seen such an increase in flooding events. A lot of our hurricanes recently, most of the damage has been flooding. So you are seeing those private market carriers come in or their rates being significantly higher in areas where flooding is much more likely, which is why the NFIP usually ends up being the best rates there. So really not availability it's not impacting availability as much as just the overall rates and what it costs to be in a flood zone. And then I would say just what's been happening with the storms, I think, is having a lot of people wanting to stay out of flood zones they previously may have wanted to be in. So someone who may have looked at a beachfront property and thought, oh, I'd love to live on the beach, now is probably thinking, I don't want to go through what I saw those people go through. So
Yeah.
it might be just changing who's wanting those houses.
Yes. So would you say buyers should consider the long-term resale value in these flood-prone areas?
I would definitely keep it in mind. I mean, especially if you're looking to buy a house that has had experienced flood losses before, and you're willing to take on that risk and that exposure, like of a severe repetitive loss property, it's a really big thing to consider. What would a future buyer think about? Am I going to be in this house for life? And am I going to want to sell it? Do I plan to elevate it to get it out of that high flood risk in that severe repetitive loss qualification? What am I going to do about the house down the road? Keeping an eye on what the future rate is. Like I said, getting just a blanket NFIP quote today will give you an idea of what the future rates look like. So if it's going to be $8,000 down the road, do you feel like that will impact your ability to sell the home? So I think no matter what, there's always people willing to pay those prices to live in certain areas. So I wouldn't say that it's necessarily something you can't get into. I mean, we had someone who wanted us to insure a home that flooded every single time it rained. And I asked him at one point, I was like, what do you plan to do with your belongings? And he was like, oh, I've got, what are those little like horse structure things that you can put like boats on and stuff? He's like, I've got a bunch of those. I'm just going to put all my furniture on that. So he bought a house knowing it would flood, and then planning eventually to elevate it. And so that has been kind of a whole process for him because this all happened during risk rating 2.0. So it was a little bit of a nightmare. But some people are willing to get into high risk areas and they're willing to take precautions or live with it. So you never know what's in the mind of a buyer. But as long as you know all the future things to expect and you can provide that information, I always say that like flood insurance rates, things like that, insurance in general doesn't kill deals. Surprises kill deals. So the more information you can provide to buyers up front, the more prepared they are and they come into it expecting, knowing, and understanding the risk. And you don't end up with those deals falling through.
Yeah, this can be one of the benefits of that, of having that seller, request a flood claims history from FEMA, because you don't. I mean, just worst case scenario I can think of is a buyer coming in, they are not aware of the past flood history, and let's say that current seller they filled out the flood disclosure that's required now on the contract side, and they're not aware of any flood issues in the past. Well, maybe the house flooded twice, 15, 20 years ago. So the new buyer comes in, they flood once, and now their house becomes a severe repetitive loss home, and they're like, wait, what? So there is some benefits to just having that form requested and knowing. I mean, if I was a buyer, I'd want to know if the house is flooded in the
loss
past
history
before.
report.
Yes.
Yeah, the thing to keep in mind with the flood disclosure is it says, have I ever filed a
Exactly.
flood claim? Have I ever requested NFIP assistance? It doesn't say, am I aware of the house ever flooding?
Right.
So if someone has purchased the house after a major storm event, then you can't really rely on that as much. So
Exactly.
I would personally ask for the flood loss history report. A seller doesn't have to provide it, so there's that. But the more information given, I think the better the deal will go.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
We talk a lot about elevating. What is Florida's base flood elevation and why does it matter?
So the base flood elevation is the elevation at which they're expecting flooding to occur. So they're saying we think that at 10 feet is how high the water will come if there's a flooding event in that 100-year storm. It's different everywhere. So it could be different on one street from another street. One house to another house could have a different BFE. So what that means is just if you're building a new home or you're elevating your home, you have to have your first living floor above that base flood elevation. Now, if you're in a V zone and we're taking velocity into account, it has to be a little higher because, again, that wave action, so the rules change a little there. But if you're above base flood elevation, that's where flood rates are lower. If you're below it, that's where flood rates are higher.
Gotcha. Let's hit you with some rapid fire questions. So you both will have to answer. All right.
Okay.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Here we go. One myth about flood insurance you wish would disappear.
That there is such a thing as no risk. There is no such a thing as no risk flood insurance or no risk flood zone. Everything's a risk. It's just low enough for the lender to not require it. That's an X zone.
Flood insurance doesn't pay out, so I'm not going to get a policy. I'll just get FEMA to cover me in the event of a loss. It's a loan. You have to pay it back, and then it means that you have to carry flood insurance on the house in perpetuity. So while the coverage may not be made to make you whole, flood insurance is much better than not having it.
Correct.
One question every buyer forgets to ask, but shouldn't. You go first.
Probably to make sure to find out if there's been any prior flood losses or flood claims filed, and asking the neighbors if there's been any flooding would be, I think.
Well, just the basic. Can I get a quote for my flood insurance, for what the flood insurance on this house is going to be? Getting that up front as quickly as possible, maybe even before you go under contract.
Okay. Biggest mistake realtors make when dealing with flood zones. Go first.
Thinking that they know as much as an insurance agent about it, and not staying in their lane and communicating things to the buyer that are not true or inaccurate.
Yeah, I would say the fact that X zone does not need flood insurance. It means you're
Yes.
not in a flood zone. You are still in a flood zone, just a low risk flood zone.
Yes.
Perfect. Well, let's give a big thank you to Lindsay and Jason of Florida Best Quote Insurance for sharing their insights today.
All right, thank you
Thank
so
you
much
so
for
much.
having us.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Got a good tag team partner over here.
Yes, you did. It was a great tag team. I like it. If you're a realtor watching this, remember that the flood zone conversation is not just about maps. It's about educating your clients, asking the right questions early, and helping buyers understand how flood risk and insurance costs can impact affordability and long-term ownership. And for all the consumers listening, whether you're considering a home in a flood zone or you're just starting your search, the most important step is getting informed. Talk with a trusted realtor and an insurance professional who can help you understand the risk, the coverage, and what it means for your specific situation before you even move forward. Make sure you download, subscribe, share, and turn on notifications so you never miss the heat. More expert guests, real conversations, and practical strategies are coming your way on Hot Topics live from the Fabre Frameworks studio. Fabre Frameworks, specializing in professional real estate photography that helps listings stand out and attract buyers and make a powerful first impression. Learn more at FabreFrameworks.com, the official studio home of the Suncoast Tampa Living Podcast Network. This is your host signing off. Until next time, keep pushing boundaries, delivering value, and standing out like the star you are.